Hi everybody.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Back on the sofa.
Back on the sofa. There's only one person in the group that was here yesterday, though.
There's not. There's loads. There's loads. They were all here yesterday.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's session. Delighted this afternoon to welcome Victoria Bagnall to join us. Victoria is going to be talking to us about executive functioning. I nearly said that wrong. I've got something else on my mind at the moment. I've been writing a presentation all day. There is one person in this group who knows what I've been writing it about, and they know where my brain is. It definitely wasn't on executive functioning. Anyway, Victoria is presenting for us this afternoon. I'm really looking forward to this session. I think it's going to be valuable for lots of you in your roles. So good luck, everybody. And I'm going to pass over to Victoria.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here and sharing what I know about executive functions with you all. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this is all going to work. We did a practice session. Are you able to see that? Oh, it's jumped out again. Is it working now? I think so. Good. So we're going to be talking about executive functions and how using executive function pedagogy can actually save us time in the classroom and foster belonging, which is such an important part of young people's development, which often gets forgotten in school. So we're going to be focusing on that today, but I'm going to be taking you through what executive functions are and then how this pedagogy can help too. So getting started, we are going to be using menti.com today for those of you that have used it before. So you can either use the QR code here and scan that QR code on your camera like you would do with something to do with COVID, but it's a lot more fun, this I can promise, than anything to do with the NHS app. And you will get access to the interactive element. And once you're on there, if you wouldn't mind just liking this page, and that will just show us all one person's managed to make it on. That's always a success. So as many of you as possible can join us, that would be great. If you can't use the QR code for whatever reason, you can go to menti.com and you can type in the code 7610 39 56. That's 7610 39 56. I sound a bit like a bingo caller when I say that, but that will help you to get there too. Also, just to point you in the direction of the chat, hopefully it's still there from before, but if not, if Gavin or Abigail, if you could just resend that. I know on Zoom, if you're not there at the beginning, it doesn't always show up for people. There is a link to a handout, which is a downloadable handout for you with a lot of the information I'm going to be talking about today, just so that you don't have to scribble everything down. You've got some notes there as well to help you. So great. So I can see we've got at least 9 people that have joined us. There will be instructions on how to join all the interactive element as well. So if people do join us later, they will be able to join in too. So that's wonderful. Thank you so much. So just a bit of housekeeping. So I've talked about the clickable links on the handout, so do access that. I'm going to be giving you an interactive presentation today, and we're going to be looking at what are executive functions, the neuroscience, but don't worry, I'm going to keep it simple and easy to understand, behind executive functions and their link with neurodiverse traits, but also how to foster the development of strong executive functions in your classrooms and to develop this pedagogy of belonging, which helps all children in every classroom. It's not just for those on the SEN register. So, first of all, I would like to get a little bit of an idea of who's in the audience today. So if you wouldn't mind just filling out this bit of the interactive element, it's really just a test that it's working, so that we've got an idea of who we've got joining us today. Super. Fabulous. Okay, great stuff. Super, so it seems we've got quite a few SENCOs with us, some others as well, so I'm fascinated who they are. If you could pop that in the chat, that would be really helpful too, and some classroom teachers as well. So really lovely to see you all with us today, and really looking forward to getting to know you a bit better and to introducing you to executive functions, or if you already know about executive functions, to furthering your knowledge about them. So this next one's really lovely, I think, and thinking about this is aimed at SENCO, so I'm assuming we all work with neurodiverse children. Even if we're classroom teachers, I'm sure we work with neurodiverse children. In fact, there's estimates of 30 to 40% of the population having neurodiverse traits. So I'm sure that we all have experience of working with neurodiverse children. But if you wouldn't mind just popping 3 words into the Mentimeter now to describe the neurodiverse children you support in 3 words, and it's going to create a lovely word cloud for us, just looking at some of the amazing things that they are, but also some of the challenges they might face as well. So interesting's coming up as a big one there. That's really lovely. Enlightening, fun, amazing, complex, free thinking, innovative, enlightening, unusual, fabulous, unique coming up as a big one there. Amazing. That's super to see that coming up. And I do love these word clouds because they really do help us to just reflect on how lucky we are, I think, to do the work that we do. There isn't a person that comes through our doors at Connections in Mind that we don't think, wow, this person's got so many gifts and so much to offer the world. Fabulous. So unique, amazing, different, interesting, unusual, inspiring are coming out as the big ones. And that's just so positive. And thank you so much for contributing that today. That's lovely to see. So a little bit of introduction to myself and why I'm here speaking to you about executive functions today. So I have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia, but at the time I got my diagnosis, they didn't really know what was wrong with me. They knew I struggled somehow with some of my reading and writing, but I didn't really kind of meet many of the thresholds, but I really struggled. I was very anxious at school, really struggled with many of the kind of basic things at school, but was clearly quite intelligent. So I was a bit confusing to people. They didn't quite know which pigeonhole to put me into. I think today, if I'd gone to a progressive psychologist, I might have got a diagnosis of executive function disorder, which is being given out more these days. It's not in the DSM yet, but it is, and we're going to be talking about that, very closely associated with ADHD, dyslexia and ASD, as well as all neurodiverse conditions, or traits, I should say. Despite my dyslexia and my neurodiversity, I managed to get a place at Cambridge University to read geography, which was probably the hardest 3 years of my life, trying to keep up with my neurotypical peers at one of the most demanding universities in the world, probably. But I did it, and I wear that as my badge of honour. It was really tough. First of all, just learning how to write the kind of essays that they wanted me to write was really difficult, but I did manage to get my 2-1 in the end, and I'm very proud of that achievement. I left university, went to work in the food industry, but then decided that I would quite like to become a teacher and did my PGCE in secondary geography teaching. I then left the profession to become an SEN tutor. And that's how I got into executive functions, and I'll come back to that in a bit later. I'm also a parent, I should say, of 3 gorgeous girls. I'm also their teacher too, and they're 3, 6 and 10. So I've really got that kind of primary school age kids at home and really understand the trials and tribulations of bringing up neurodiverse children in this day and age, because they all have many of the traits that I and my husband also have too. I am one of the founders of Connections in Mind, which is the organisation I'm going to be talking about today, and also The Code, which is a tutoring organisation which has tutors who are trained in executive functioning too, and they're much more kind of empathetic and aware of these challenges. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my light bulb moment. And a light bulb moment for us at Connections in Mind is the moment where we find out about executive functions and everything in our lives tends to just fit into place, and suddenly we're like, oh yes, that all makes sense now. And I'm hoping that some of you are going to have a bit of a light bulb moment today. We normally have a few every time we do a talk who are just blown away, just like, why didn't I know about this before? So I'm really hoping that some of you are going to have that this evening, or this afternoon I should say, as well. So my light bulb moment happened after many years of repeated crisis, and I had a repeated crisis really because of the self-talk that I had around my executive function challenges and my neurodiversity. I was told repeatedly that I was lazy, disorganized, that I just wasn't good enough really to be in school, part of the family. I was always messing up to some degree and letting people down. And it really took its toll on me, getting all this feedback from other people, and it became my self-talk, and my mental health spiraled downwards. And so I was in and out of repeated crisis, to the point where I was suggested that maybe I had bipolar disorder, which at the time I was like, no, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not really what's going on for me. But I have been in and out of repeated crisis in my kind of younger adult years. I have to say, since I found out about executive functions, that I haven't been down that road again, because I think now I have a reason for why I have these challenges, which doesn't blame me as a person, but instead blames the skill set that I have, or blames is the wrong word, but kind of gives responsibility to the skills that I have, and it's something that I'm working on, and that I'm much more compassionate to myself now, because I understand that it's not to do with my character, that I'm not a bad person, but that actually I that I have this skills deficit that I need to work on, or I've got challenges that I need to overcome. So just a different perspective that I have now, which has helped me a lot. And I had my light bulb moment when I was working as an SEN tutor with a young lady who was off the scale bright. So she got the highest ever score on the Oxford Thinking Scales assessment to get into Oxford University. So she's off the scale intelligent, but she just couldn't get the mechanics of learning done. So she found it really difficult to complete homework. She found it really difficult to do any revision. She struggled so hard writing essays. She was such a perfectionist, although the stuff that she was producing when we could get her to do work was just phenomenal. She had to be heavily medicated to access her A-levels, where she did brilliantly, even though she was under the influence of a lot of medication in order to get in there, because she was really, really anxious and had a lot of performance anxiety. So I was working with this particular young lady, and I was working alongside a psychiatrist, supporting this young lady as a team, and I was just flummoxed by this young lady. Couldn't understand how she could be so bright but yet find these things so challenging. And she recommended this book, and I recommend it to you as well. It's called Smart But Scattered Teens. For those of you working with teens, there's also a purple one which is for kids and a white one which is for adults as well. It's written by this lovely lady called Peg Dawson, who's one of the most generous professionals that I've ever come across. She's become my mentor, because once I read the book, I jumped on the first plane over to America, went to one of her talks that she held in Boston, and invited her out for lunch. So please come to the UK. We need this in the UK. And that was back in 2015. She came over later that year, and we held the first ever training in executive function coaches in the UK. And that's where I met my future partners in the organisation, Dr. Bettina Honan, who's a clinical psychologist working at Queen Anne Street in London, and also Imogen Moore-Shelley, who is an education and psychology researcher at Cambridge University. So that was my light bulb moment, and we went on, Imogen and Bettina and I, to set up Connections in Mind, and our mission really is to change the world. It's just a small thing that we want to achieve, but I've dedicated my life to raising awareness about executive function challenges and helping people to understand that these are not character flaws, but instead they are skills and challenges that we need to learn and overcome. And I think when we change our lens towards these things I'm going to be talking about in a minute, it can be so powerful, not just in education, but in the criminal justice system, in parenting, in the workplace, just all over, can help change our perceptions of other people and be kinder and more compassionate to each other. And we do this through supporting people to overcome their challenges. And we do that by working one-on-one with people, by training people who work with young people and adults, and also through running consultancies and workshops and things with schools and organisations. So wherever we can offer support and help, we are absolutely willing and able to do so. So I've just been chatting about this term executive functions. It was in the title of the talk, but I want to know, what's your knowledge of executive functions? Okay, great. Fabulous. Great. Well, it's lovely to see and really helps me to know how to pitch it. There seems to be some people who've never heard of executive functions before, some people who've got a little bit of a knowledge, most people rating themselves around the middle and kind of tailing off towards the expert. We haven't really got any experts necessarily in the room today, but more people kind of that middling knowledge, which is great. I will make sure I cover everything for those who are newbies, but also I'll extend it a bit as well for those who already do know a bit about executive functions. So thank you so much for sharing. That helps me to know how to pitch my talk. So what are executive functions? Executive functions are cognitive processes, which means brain processes, which reside in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So that's the bit of our brain behind our forehead here. And our executive functions are responsible for the effective and timely execution of tasks and emotional regulation. And the reason they're called executive functions is because it's all about executing tasks, getting things done. And so these important brain functions are essential for everything in life, but we're going into specifics of how they impact our lives and what we need them for in just a second. But a lot of people ask me, especially when I'm at a dinner party and I've had a couple of glasses of wine and I'm telling everyone about executive functions, getting really passionate about it. And they're like, well, you know, if this is so important, if this is going to change the world, then why don't we all know about it? And I always reply that, you know, neuroscientists are really bad at PR and telling the general public about what they've learned about the brain, but also it's really new science. Neuroscience has only really developed as a proper science, I say in inverted commas, in the last 20 or 30 years, really, because we've been able to have these MRI scanners that help us to look at the brain whilst people are still alive and see how the brain is behaving and what areas of the brain are lighting up when we're doing different things. So this is all really new knowledge that we have about the brain, and it's evolving every day, and it's such a fascinating field to be involved in. But who is effective? So everyone always asks me, oh, you know, when I go into a school and talk about this, oh yes, we'll get you in touch with the SEN department, and it is really relevant for people in the SEN department. I'll come on to why in a minute, but it is actually relevant for every single person in every school, from the caretaker to each teacher to the head teacher to the parents to the children. Everyone has a unique executive function fingerprint, and it also changes depending on what's going on for that person too as well. So we have our strengths and our challenges, and we can all have a bad EF day and a good EF day too. So yeah. Oh, thank you. That's a lovely comment. Thanks so much. So what does it mean for our lives? What are the actual things that this impacts? You know, getting stuff done. What is that? So it's about meeting deadlines, prioritizing our work to be completed, regulating our emotions, so self-regulated learning, you know, this is absolutely essential, inhibiting our responses, so not doing things that our instincts want us to do, like hitting or having chewing gum in class when we shouldn't do, or changing out of our trainers when we're not supposed to, so on and so forth. Organising our belongings, so keeping track of things, keeping things tidy, not losing sunglasses, house keys, etc. Organising thoughts on paper, so essay writing, you need a lot of executive functioning for that. Holding information in our heads, that's our working memory. Keeping time, and with that one we always need to remember that time and especially in the West, the value of timekeeping is a very Western cultural construct. If you go to other parts of the world, like the Middle East or Africa, people, they don't really regard keeping time and punctuality as such an important part of your kind of character as we do in the West. It's quite an interesting one, that time. I'm always interested in the research coming out about that and the different way different cultures perceive time. And then also thinking flexibly. So we've needed a lot of the ability to think flexibly during COVID, because things have been changing all the time, especially in the teaching profession, because for 1 minute, you know, we had Gavin Williamson saying school's definitely going ahead, and then 4 days later, no, school's not going ahead, and everyone having to change their plans. So we needed a lot of flexibility in order to be there and show up for the young people in our lives at a time which was really traumatic for everyone. So it's been really challenging for us. But I wonder which of these challenges, and let's just reflect instead of, yeah, well, let's reflect for ourselves, actually. This says, do the children in your care struggle with? But let's think about ourselves, actually, because I think it is quite interesting to think about, you know, even at the heights of our careers, how we might struggle with these things. So yes, a bit of self-reflection now. Which ones of these do you struggle with? And you can choose as many as you like, and it's going to create a lovely donut for us in the middle of all the different colours, hopefully. Super. So interesting seeing this coming together. Thank you so much for being so reflective and sharing this. Fascinating to see working memory coming out as the one that we really struggle with. And it's not surprising, because you can only normally, if you're neurotypical, you can only keep 7 things in your head at once on average. And as teachers, we often keep putting things in and they keep falling out the other side, surprisingly enough. So we need to manage our working memory and our cognitive load quite carefully. Organising our thoughts on paper has come up, quite a high one there too, which is really interesting, and regulating our emotions. So you're obviously very aware of emotional literacy. It's very interesting when you go into schools and you do this presentation where they haven't got to that emotional literacy piece yet. And a lot of teachers are like, oh no, I'm very good at regulating my emotions. And you can tell that they clearly haven't done any work in that area. So really interesting to see that you're quite reflective about that. It's part of being a human being to struggle with these things. There's no shame in it, but yet society will make us think that it's shameful if we can't do these things. And so this is what we have to fight against, and that's why we need to change the world, to change that perception. So we're going to be talking about these 3 core brain functions, and you can go to conferences on executive functioning and sit with a whole load of neuroscientists while they argue out how many executive functions they are. But there's a general consensus that there are 3 core brain functions, and we're going to be talking about the associated skills in just a moment. So there's cognitive flexibility, which is our ability to mentally play with ideas. There's our inhibitory control, our ability to stop ourselves from following our instincts. And our working memory, which is our ability to hold information in our heads. Now, these 3 core brain functions cross over in real life to present these skills that we work with at Connections in Mind, because you can't really kind of measure a brain function, but you can measure skills. And so that's the work that we do at Connections in Mind. But you can see how the 3 core executive functions just play into all of these things. So for example, well, you've got working memory and flexibility and response inhibition there. So those 3 covered off. But in order to manage your time well, you have got to you've got to hold in your head when you have to be somewhere, and remember that you've got to be somewhere. So you need your working memory. You also need your response inhibition when you're on your way to your appointment with the dentist and you suddenly think, oh gosh, I'm feeling really anxious about this, I might just go and have a coffee instead. You've got to not do that. You also have to be flexible in order to manage your time, because inevitably something's going to come up on your journey to somewhere or on your way to do something that might be distracting, or might be difficult, or might be not something you didn't plan. You've got to compose yourself, not get emotionally dysregulated, and find a solution to said problem in order to manage your time. So you need a lot of executive functioning to manage your time. In order to get started on tasks, you need a lot of response inhibition, because you've got to inhibit your response to watch YouTube, which is what a lot of kids would much rather be doing than getting started on their homework. But you've also had the working memory of what you need to do, and the flexibility for when something tough comes up to keep going at it. Metacognition is a really interesting one, and metacognition, we need a lot of cognitive flexibility, because we need to think about things from a different perspective, not from the only perspective that we have in our brain. We need to think meta about our thinking. We need to have a different perspective on it. So we need a lot of flexibility, and we need a lot of response inhibition as well, to stop ourselves from, and we need this with mindfulness too, to stop ourselves from thinking that our thoughts are reality, and actually to analyze our thoughts and thinking, and to step back and have that helicopter view of ourselves. So all of these things you need a lot of executive functioning for, and these are the 11 executive function skills. that we work on at Connections in Mind. And it's really helpful to have 11. I know it sounds like a lot, but when you're working with children in a classroom and they have this literacy around these particular terms, they can then verbalize to you what's getting in the way of them being able to do the learning that they need to do. And this is how we start saving time, because when children have a language where they can start saying, you know, you can say you've set a task around maybe some fractions in class, and you can say to the class, right, okay, we've got this task to do about fractions. What's going to get in the way of our ability to do our fractions today? And little hands go up and say, oh, what response inhibition, miss, because I hate fractions and I'm going to want to just chat to my mates, but I know I need to do my fractions. Okay, great. Metacognition for someone else because they really struggle to know how well they're doing and what they're supposed to be doing. Sustained attention for someone else, and they can start talking about what's getting in the way for them as individuals without you having to go around as a teacher and kind of sit down with them and reteach the lesson again and again, which is what we often end up doing. And if they can articulate what's going on for them, then they can have a strategy bank of things that they can do and help to overcome these challenges because they have identified what's getting in the way of their learning. So it's a really great way of saving teachers and children, for that matter, a lot of time and helping them to be more self-regulated and metacognitive in their learning. And executive function skills are needed for every part of learning. They are just so fundamental and embedded, but yet we don't teach them specifically in schools. So not shouting out in class, being able to self-reflect, being able to write an essay, being able to do your homework, being able to revise, being able to sit exams, they all need a plethora of executive functions. And so it's kind of the elephant in the room, really. Our executive functions are the cogs behind the cognition, behind the learning, but we don't actually, traditionally, we don't specifically teach these skills within school, but we believe that if we do work on that and do help young people to develop strategies that work for themselves, then they can feel like they belong more in school, because this is something that everybody's working on, not just those in the SEN, under SEN care. And a lot of people ask me about the links between executive functions and neurodiversity, and there's a very, very clear link, and more research is coming out every day. My instinct is that in 20 years' time or so, we'll be talking about executive function disorder with traits of ADHD, dyslexia, ASD, etc., because what we're finding now is the root cause of many of these challenges is an executive function deficit, which I use in inverted commas. But this is Russell Barkley here. He's like the godfather of ADHD, and he talks about ADHD being executive function disorder. It's all about the executive functions. And he also says, and I won't read this all out, but he talks about how we can modify the environment and make accommodations to facilitate the individual's use of their own self-control. So it's not fixed. We can improve and we can put things in place to help people to develop better executive functioning and executive function skills. There's also a link with dyslexia, and this was in 2004 where they were talking about a link there in dyslexia research, but also this research back in only in 2019, so only 3 years ago, in the Journal of Cognitive Psychology, thinking about executive functions being a shared deficit underpinning all variants of neurodevelopmental disorders. So there's a really clear link there. And I tend to think about it in terms of those three areas of executive functioning. I just wonder if I can sit back now into this, because it's clear that ADHD is really linked with inhibitory control, but also working memory is really linked with dyslexia, because it's about the phonological working memory and the ability to hold information in our head whilst we're reading, and comprehension and so on and so forth. But also, if you think about cognitive flexibility, that's really quite closely aligned with ASD as well. And so you can see how these core brain functions are mimicked in the challenges that we see in young people and adults with neurodiverse traits. Sorry, just going back there, I just wanted to bring that up. So we're going to be thinking now about brain maturity and executive functioning. So which age range do you think the human brain is considered to be fully mature? Really interesting results coming up here. Thank you, everybody. Super. Really, really interesting there. So thanks so much for contributing there. So those of you that said 26 to 30, that would be for neurotypical brains. Yes, neurotypical brains fully mature by our late 20s, but those of us with neurodevelopmental disorders, developmental means can be kind of develop later, and so often our executive functions can fully develop a lot later for those of us with neurodiverse traits as well. So yeah, so really really bizarre that we have you know, young people considered as adults at the age of 18 when actually their brains don't fully mature until their late 20s and early 30s. Thank you so much for that. So thinking about when these executive function skills develop, we're looking, and this is looking at neurotypicals and looking at patterns for when there isn't an intervention to help the development of their executive function skills. So naturally within society, this is what we're looking at. So those first three executive functions come online in our toddler years: the working memory, you know, the object permanence and remembering that there was something on your tray of your high chair and throwing it off and expecting someone to put it back again. That's to do with our working memory. Our cognitive flexibility and our response inhibition begin to develop in those early years. But it's not until we reach primary school that our emotional control, sustained attention and flexibility really start emerging. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That's when we're able to sit still in class and control our emotions and do things as a class, and that's when we, you know, start getting to those primary age. So that kind of makes sense. But what's interesting is that our task initiation, so that's the opposite of procrastination, it's getting started on things, our planning and prioritization and our organization don't really start naturally developing until our secondary school years. But it's not until our late 20s that time management, goal-directed persistence and metacognition fully develop. And that's really interesting because we're often talking about children being metacognitive and applying kind of an adult view of metacognition to much younger children when actually they just don't have the mental capacity to do that because their executive functions are not fully developed yet. And so we need to be careful about that. It doesn't mean they can't be metacognitive, but they need a lot more scaffolding in order to do that and be able and pointers as to how to reflect and be self-aware. But what we tend to find is that those young people who have abnormally strong executive function, so they're really good at time management and goal-directed persistence and metacognition around their GCSE years, which is abnormally strong and abnormally developed, they're the ones that do really well at their GCSEs and A-levels. Bit ironic, really. So we're testing something that isn't taught, first of all, and second of all, it doesn't actually develop in the general population until much, much later. But there is good news, and the good news is about neuroplasticity and that we can all change our brains. It doesn't mean it's easy. I'm not trying to trivialize it, but I just wanted to let you know that we can do that. And I've got a lovely video for us to play now, just to have a look at that as well. So here we go. They're going to play for me. There we go. It's doing it. It's just thinking about it. The sound will come
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain was pretty much fixed after childhood. But recent advances now tell us they were mistaken. The brain can, and does, change throughout our lives. We can mould it, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. But how does neuroplasticity work? Our brain is a bit like a computer circuit board. There are billions of pathways sending messages every time you feel, do, or think something. Some of these pathways are like superhighways. These are our habits, our embedded ways of being. Every time we think in a familiar way, complete a particular task, or feel a certain emotion, we widen the pathway, and it becomes easier for our brains to send these messages. Now, if we think about something from another perspective, try a new task or choose a different emotion, we start treading a new pathway. And if we keep using that path, it gets wider and smoother, becoming a superhighway. And this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway is bypassed and deteriorates. This is neuroplasticity in action. No matter how old we are, we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. It takes effort and regular repetition, but everyone can rewire their brains to create new superhighways.
Brilliant. So hopefully I can escape from this now. There we are. So that video, and that's available for free on YouTube if you want to have a look at it and use it. It's also available on our CIM learning website as well. And yeah, and it's really helpful at helping young people to understand that they can change their brains, because a lot of young people have quite a fixed mindset and don't believe that they can change and do things differently. But it's also important to remember that there's this rule of 60, and that it takes 60 iterations of a task before it becomes embedded, and therefore it's not. Sorry, I just seen Gavin and Abigail pop up there. Is everything all right, folks? Yeah, all good. Fabulous. It takes us 60 iterations to secure a new task as a habit in our heads. And so we need to keep young people going for 60 times of doing something. And when you have ADHD or executive function challenges, it's really hard to keep going for 60 iterations to do something. So we need to support them to do that. But also there are these building blocks of strong executive functioning that are so essential, and often people come to us in quite a state of emotional and mental kind of disarray, and they're not looking after themselves because of their executive function challenges. But what we know from the research is that all of these things are so essential to strong executive functioning, so that young people have to feel safe. They have to have done exercise recently. They have to have connected with other people. They have to have done things that they find fun and joyful, but also have had to have moments of calm, slept well, and eaten well too. And there are these three core areas of the brain stem, the limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex. Now, I'm really simplifying things here, but just it's really helpful when we're talking to children to try and get them to understand these different parts of the brain. And this hand model of the brain is really useful. And if you wouldn't mind following along with me, so I've just got my hand up here with the palm of my hand. There we go. Gavin's got his up. Yeah, that's super. Well done. He's got both of them up. And just tuck your thumb across the top there. There we go. That's your amygdala. There, your limbic system, the emotional part of your brain, and your prefrontal cortex sits over the top, and it regulates your fight, flight, or freeze response, that amygdala response. And when everything's fine and dandy and our executive functions are working optimally, that's able to do that job really well. But when, for whatever reason, we become dysregulated, or we haven't eaten recently, or we haven't slept well, our executive functions are less connected with our amygdala, and we're living in our fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain. And we call this flipping your lid. When you're like that. And it's very difficult to reason with a young person, or an adult for that matter, when their lid is flipped. You have to wait for those executive functions to come back online. So that's why we have like hangry. You can all relate to hangry, I'm sure, of when you haven't eaten recently, you get really angry, and you know your partner or whatever might, you know, just have something to eat, because then you'll feel a lot better. And that's all to do with our executive functioning, and our body is prioritizing eating, and our instinctual responses, not those other responses, those more rational kind of, you know, you're not gonna be able to think about a PowerPoint if you're really hungry. And trauma is really closely linked with executive functioning too. And this is research coming out of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, all up to the minute research about how early childhood trauma can impair the development of the prefrontal cortex. And that kind of makes sense. If you're always living in your fight, flight or freeze part of your brain, this part of your brain will not get the chance to develop as you might expect it would, or as optimally. But the same with adults as well. If we have excessive stress, like we all had in COVID, we'll experience what we call brain fog, where we find it difficult to get things done. And that's why everyone talks about brain fog and COVID. It's not because of the actual virus itself giving us brain fog. It's because we're super stressed by what's happened, and that affects the ability of our executive function to do what they need to do. And there is also long COVID as well, which can have effects on things. I don't want to kind of minimize that, but that general brain fog that everyone was talking about in the midst of COVID is very closely linked to our executive functions. So what can we do to help to develop strong executive functions? So we need to look after the building blocks of our executive functions. That's absolutely fundamental. And so we really need to prioritize these things. And that feeling of connection with other people and making sure we belong is so essential. There is this step-by-step guide. I talked about this book before, so do look these books up, and they're on our reading and resources page, which there's a link on your handout. But also we have this 3-step approach at Connections in Mind, and this is the pedagogy that I was talking to you about. And I'm just going to quickly run through it a little bit because I know I want to get onto some questions in a moment. But the 3 stages are connect, collaborate and support. So connection is all about understanding our executive function challenges. Collaboration is working alongside young people to help them to work out strategies that work for themselves. And then the support is putting that support in place for those 60 iterations of a task before it becomes a habit, and making sure we don't just send them off, oh, you know, just do this particular intervention and expecting them to do it 60 times, because they won't. We have to support them to do it. So connection is all about empathy, and for those of you into Brené Brown, it's such an important part of connection with other people. And executive function literacy is really important too. When we have a language to talk about what's going on for us, then we can verbalize that and our teacher understands what's going on for us. So it's so powerful. And if we do that with the whole class, it saves us time, because everybody has these challenges, not just the people with executive function challenges per se, the neurodiverse people. It's every single person in every single class can benefit from talking about these things. But also we need to give young people autonomy. And when we have neurodiverse children as parents or as teachers, often we do a lot of things for them. We put a lot of scaffolding in place for them, and they struggle to learn to do these things themselves because we're kind of enabling them. So autonomy is key, in finding ways for children to do things on their own, make their own choices, make their own decisions, and feel like they are the architects of their own lives is so important for motivation. But also we need to use questions. So in our approach, it's all about questioning. We use coaching in our one-to-one work, and in our pedagogy, it's all about asking questions and being curious, because questions help us to build new neural pathways in the brain, rather than instructions which just ask young people to do things the way that we think we should do them. But actually, these questions can help build the new neural pathway. So using questions is so important. But it's also important to remember that we need to shepherd our young people and not try and engineer them. And Professor Russell Barkley, who's the godfather of ADHD, is very clear on this, is that young people with ADHD or other neurodiverse traits, they need more than anything just a safe environment and opportunities for development. But if we try and kind of create them into something that they don't necessarily want to be, that's not going to work. So we really need to just create that self environment for them to support them to grow and develop themselves. I always think of it kind of like a flower. You know, when a flower isn't developing well or how you would expect, you look at what you've got in the soil and the amount of water you're putting on your fertilizer and things like that, but you don't necessarily look at the flower itself and try and remedy that. You look at the environment. So that's the kind of approach that we have. But also we should use scaffolding, and this scaffolding must be put together with the help of the young person themselves. So there's no good just coming up with checklists for young people. They need to be part of the process of putting that support in place so that they understand why it's there. Otherwise, it's just another thing for them to do or to forget to do. When they have executive function challenges, that often happens. So just to say, we're here to help. Connections in Mind, we're so dedicated to helping young people and teachers and parents and anyone who wants to learn about executive functioning. And we do that in various different ways. So we do that through our expert coaches who work with young people and adults. They're professional coaches who've been through their own separate training, and then we train them in an executive function approach. And then we provide them with ongoing supervision and training to make sure that they're providing a world-class service. And executive function coaching is an emerging profession, and we are teamed up with lots of organisations in the States who are offering a similar service as well. We also offer training in CPD. Behaviour policies can be fundamental to this, because imagine if you're constantly getting told off for minor misdemeanours and getting strikes and minuses or demerits because of your executive function challenges. Of course, then you don't feel like you belong in school and you can't flourish and you feel that you're misunderstood. So we do work a lot on behaviour policies, looking at our pedagogy training, which I'll show you a clip of in a second. We also do coach training, so we're not precious about our coaching approach, and we're very happy to share that. So if you've got any TAs, or if as SENCOs that would like to learn how to be a coach and offer that coaching within your school, we are very happy to do that. You don't have to come and get the coaching service from us. You can learn how to do it yourself, and it's very affordable. We also offer consultancy and research partnerships with Cambridge University and their Department for Education and Psychology. So I'm just going to quickly show you a clip of the pedagogy in action. I'll literally keep it to a couple of seconds, but just so that you can see what we're aiming for with this pedagogy and how it can save teachers time. And then we're almost ready for some questions. So make sure you're getting ready.
Okay, ladies and gents, our learning goal for the last little while has been to independently solve multi-step math problems. And you know what that's when there's more than one step to solving a math problem. And you've done such a wonderful job with it. Last week we co-created our...
Oh, it's buffering. Sorry, guys.
...our success criteria that you have been quite frequently using. But today, Miss Faith and I just wanted to check in with you about some barriers and obstacles that you might come across when you are problem solving math. And please remember, this is something that adults struggle with and find hard. Even Miss Clements does when she's working at the farm doing her math calculations. It's hard for me too, and I've come across these barriers, but it's important for me to hear your voices. And I'd love to know what is tricky for you when you are problem solving math problems in our class. What's tricky for you? An obstacle, a roadblock. Sav?
Maybe if it's a test and we're not able to communicate with you and we're not feeling confident with the test, yeah.
So two things you said, independent task and low confidence with the material.
Yeah.
Okay, so what does that kind of sound like? If you're not feeling really confident, if you're really having trouble starting that independent task, what does that sound like, Meg?
Goal-directed persistence or emotional control.
Goal-directed persistence and emotional control. What are some...
Okay, I'm going to pause it there. For anyone who wants to have a look at the longer clip, I will send that round. But just to show how literate those young people are in those executive function skills, they would just, these kids are around 10 and 11 years old and able to articulate that they might be struggling with their emotional regulation, their goal-directed persistence. So, and then they get on later on in that clip, just looking at some of the strategies they might use to overcome those challenges as well. So really helping to create really self-reflective, self-regulated learners with every single child in the class, not just a small group. We can also help with statistical profiling as well. So we can do parent or child self-report questionnaires to help you profile the children within your school about their executive functions and which are their strengths and challenges, give recommendations for parents, and give you data sets as well for a gap analysis to see which are the challenges that the children are facing the most. And so you can focus your training and development of executive functions in those particular areas. We also have some SENCO training that we're offering next year, where we're going to be really training you in the EF profiling and then the support design, so how you would take the results of that profiling and then design the support for that young person if you wanted to do something outside the classroom too. That's the 5-part training, and we're looking at the theory behind all of this, design of the support, and then how to implement it, because sometimes implementing and keeping going can be hard, and also working alongside other SENCOs from different schools and hearing what's working well and not so well from them and learning from that as well. So it's with teachers from other schools too. I talked about the coach training. It's 30 hours training, and it's a blended learning. So it's self-study modules with videos and reading, and then also practical training where you get to test out your skills on practice. It's over 5 weeks, and by the time you finish, you're ready to start practicing, and we have ongoing supervision available as well. Also, just want to signpost you to CIM Learning, which is our online learning site where you can learn all about executive functions. There's lots of free and paid for courses there. And also we're on Facebook and LinkedIn and something called Mighty Networks as well. So do look us up there. And I'd like to know, what's your main takeaway from today before we get on to the questions? So what was your main takeaway? This just helps me to kind of self-evaluate, and there's a little bit of a plenary to today for me, and hopefully for you and your peers too. So what is your main takeaway? What have you learned today about executive functions and about our approach? No, all either writing essays or you didn't learn anything. Nerve-wracking time. There we go. Explicit teaching of executive functions is really important. Yeah, assessment profiling tool to identify the strengths and gaps. The logistics behind executive function. The same issues crop up in schools around the world and what we can do to make a difference. Good. Yeah, understanding the overarching influence of EF on learning. The whole class approach. Shepherding, not engineering, and questioning. Great. I'm really glad that one resonated. How EF covers so many other neurodiverse. Yes, a lot of people just think it's ADHD, but it's not. It's across the board. Age at which metacognition is considered to be. Yeah, that is always a big one for SENCOs because we're often talking about metacognition so much, but we have to be aware that young people don't have the metacognition we do as adults, so expecting them to is asking them too much. Really positive way of looking at executive functioning. Thank you. I love that students need to be involved in creating strategies. Absolutely. The brain matures a lot later than I thought, and EF profiling is available and interested in knowing more about that. Brilliant. Please do get in contact. Executive functions are also related to emotional regulation. Yeah, the 60 iterations, such an important bit of learning there. Yeah, the amount of repetition. Everyone in education should be aware of executive functioning. Yes, they should. I'm glad you agree. That fills my heart with joy to hear that. So thank you so much. And hopefully now I can stop screen sharing and we can get some people up. Has that worked? There we go. We can get some people up to ask some questions.
There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Victoria. That was great. We've got a question here. Do you have a formal assessment that you can recommend for executive functioning?
Yes.
I think you've answered it really, but
so the brief is the kind of standardized test that you can use, which is, I forget what it stands for, something BR, then executive function is the EF at the end of it. I'm dyslexic, so I always forget these acronyms. But the brief, if you Google that, you can get it. I think it's about £2.50 a student, something like that. Maybe the price has gone up over COVID. But yeah, so you can use the brief. It's quite lengthy, which is why we have our shorter questionnaire, which we're doing with the University of Houston and trying to get that standardized. So all the data that we produce from our questionnaire goes back to the University of Houston for their work over there too.
thank you. So I've had to put the questions on the other screen. Or what's the first step as teachers to support a child?
What is the first step? So I always refer this back to the connect, collaborate, support. So the first step is to try and put yourself in their shoes. Imagine how hard it is being a child who really struggles with these things and getting this feedback from society that you're not good enough, and really get in the zone with that, develop that empathy for that child, and then help them to understand their challenges in terms of their executive functioning, because just knowing that they're not a bad person and this is a skill set that they can develop can be huge for young people. So those are the two kind of starting blocks, I would say. Then you can get on to starting on the strategies and supporting them, but not until you've really helped them to understand that you get it, will you actually have any progress with that young person.
Fantastic. We've not got any other questions come up at the moment, so guys, come on, ask us.
Ask away.
Can we access the profiles from overseas? This person's in Dubai. Thank you for joining us from Dubai.
Absolutely, yes. It's an online profiling questionnaire. So it's all done. We send you the link, which is unique to your school. We keep the data set. We're very GDPR compliant. You get access to the data set afterwards, and you can do as you will with it. If you want us to profile it and find patterns for you, we can also do that too. So yes, we can absolutely do that anywhere in the world.
Okay.
Thank you. Another good one.
I was going to ask one. I want to ask one. Okay,
what is the best age to start conversations with children about executive functioning?
Okay, so we start as young as 6. So really from reception onwards, really, 5 or 6 is fine. You can start doing a few more things a little bit earlier in the early years, but obviously being cognitive, being aware of the fact that they're only really developing those kind of basic working memory, response, inhibition, flexibility at that age. So you have to be a bit careful, but you can start building that language up. I was at a teaching conference on Tuesday, and you know, we all just recognised that actually young people are very able from a young age to talk about more complex words, and having this language can really help them. So don't be scared of words like metacognition for a 6-year-old. They can access it, but if you feel uncomfortable with that, you can. We have these cool character cards. We've got so for example, for metacognition, it's an owl, wise owl who's really self-aware, and so you can talk about it in terms of the wise owl instead of metacognition. And for emotional regulation, we've got keep calm croc, who has a little bird that sits on his shoulder, you know, little birds you see on crocodiles, and is always whispering in his ear, you know, ways to help him to regulate. So we have these kind of characters that you can use as well to help you to scaffold that conversation, or you can develop your own. It's amazing what kids come up with, so I'd recommend doing that too.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got, how would you start a whole class approach?
How do you start a whole class approach? So the first thing that I would do with that is really about building the literacy. So I'd pick a few at a time, maybe 2 or 3 at a time to introduce. And we have some fabulous sets of posters that you can put up on the wall, and you can start talking about these executive functions and how they affect teaching and learning within your classroom. Making sure you're modeling it yourself is really important too. So, you know, if you've not slept well the night before, coming in and saying, oh goodness, I didn't sleep well because of blah blah blah, you're going to have to help me with my working memory today because that's my executive function challenge. Modeling that and talking about it as part of your everyday language, it is really important. And you just build it into every lesson. You don't need to have a specific assembly or anything like that. You can just start building it into every lesson and just introducing them one at a time until you've built up that full set of 11, and then you can start working on the strategy. So it does take time, but we've been doing it with a number of schools now, and it takes probably about 6 months for the children to get their head around all 11. And then it's just from there, you know, you go into these classrooms and the classrooms are buzz with these different terms, and they use it in their self-reflections, and it's just so fantastic to see.
Fantastic, thank you. And then one that kind of links, I suppose, how would you approach it with older students who are struggling in school?
So with older students, it's really interesting. So we find that coaching works really well there. Whole school approaches can work brilliantly in the secondary sphere too, but they have to be embraced by every single teacher, because obviously they're having subject specific teachers, and it can be quite difficult to take the whole teaching staff along with you in this journey. So if you're, you know, working one-on-one and you have the opportunity to work one-on-one with these students, doing the one-to-one coaching is the best way to do that. Get them to feel really understood by you, collaborate with them, come up with strategies that work for them, and then support them over those 60 iterations to do this, to put that into practice over time. So if you're struggling to do a kind of whole school approach, then that would be where I would go with the coach training and that approach.
I'll touch it. Thank you very much, Victoria. Sorry, I see questions coming up now.
No, it's everything. Thank you.
Excited to do a questionnaire. Need to train staff next year, giving you a great starting point. And best seminar in ages. Sally, son, you need to come to more of them then. Okay. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. It was a fantastic presentation, wasn't it, Rachel? Definitely. looking forward to seeing some of you next week. Don't forget we have got IASEND joining us next week, talking about small steps of progression. So we've had B squared, we've had pivots, we might as well throw IASEND into the mix and give you all three of them to take your pick from. And they're going to do us something on
Analysing data with SEND students.
There you go.
Luckily, I remembered it. Just drop it on me there.
That's okay.
What is it? I don't know.
It's too much going through my brain. So we look forward to seeing some of you at that one next week. Thank you again, Victoria. That was absolutely brilliant. And we shall let everybody go and grab their dinners. Lorna, they're on the Eventbrite. So if you search Sensible SENCO on Eventbrite, you can find all of our network meetings advertised on there. Even the free ones we advertise on the Eventbrite, because it's much easier to do it that way.
They're all free.
Okay. Well, they're all free anyway.
They're all free.
Yeah, but
They're all free. Just join them all.
all free unless you want to make a donation, of course. Would you?
They're all free.
Donation. I need a cup of tea. Okay, guys, go and have your dinners.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye,
you, everybody.
everyone.
Take
Thanks so
care.
much.